Hi, Mike.
Hey, Bob.
How are you doing?
Very well. How are you doing today?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You're Michael McCullough. You are a professor of psychology at the University of Miami.
That's correct.
And director of the Evolution and Human Behavior Laboratory there. So
You're 3 for 3.
So far, it's all accurate. And
Yeah,
I bet
yeah.
you're not going to complain about this either when I say that you're the author of Beyond Revenge, The Evolution of the Forgiveness Instinct.
Thank you. That's true as well.
And
Yeah.
you are a co-editor of a book called The Psychology of Gratitude.
Right?
So, as all of this suggests, we may be spending some time talking about what I think, was it Darwin who called these the social instincts? It's a term you hear.
Yeah, I think maybe the social sentiments.
The social sentiments, yeah, okay. Well, then there's Adam Smith too, who
morals. He would have called them.
He would have called them moral sentiments. Okay, so we're going to talk about features of human nature that hold society together, which are sometimes very tightly integrated with features of human nature that tear it apart, as it turns out. Forgiveness
right.
being a good example. You can't forgive until there's been some sort of disruption. But let's start. I want to start with a couple of cases where you've been a little bit of a contrarian and have done work that calls into question conventional thinking about social instincts. And the first, or if that's the term, anyway, the first of these is trust. Now, for starters, I assume you hold that trust is what biologists call an adaptation. In other words, it's not, there's something in our genetic makeup, of the species that allows us to kind of turn trust on or shut it off. There are people we trust, there are people we don't, and presumably this has some basis in biological evolution.
Absolutely. It's hard to see how you can make behavior happen without, brain to implement it.
Right.
And we know that the brain processes information. So, my assumption about something like trust is that, there's, brain meat up there in the head that is grinding away on information about someone's likelihood of exploiting you. And when that information kind of takes the right shape, why you decide to, open yourself up to risk in the hope of, reaping some sort of reward, in the process.
Mm-hmm. Now, a commonly said thing about the relationship between the meat and the trust is that this chemical called oxytocin, I guess a hormone, a neurotransmitter, I guess it qualifies for both of those labels,
right.
Is the key thing. This in the spigot that turns trust on and shuts it off. That oxytocin is what's flowing. So there had been these findings that you could spray a nasal spray of oxytocin or something. There's that in you could give it to people and then they would be playing these trust games and they would in behavioral economics type settings and they would exhibit more trust. Are these the kinds of studies that you have cast doubt on?
Well, I mean, I would back up one step further just to, in the interest of kind of observing the principle of charity and point out that there are other reasons to have really strong priors about the role of oxytocin in something like that. In trust, for example, it's a really important social hormone in non-human animals where people, like Larry Young and Sue Carter have been able to do really intricate, beautiful experimental work. And they're able to show that animals that are able to engage in social affiliation and social bonding seem to be able to do so at least in part because of the role that oxytocin is playing, as you say, between the meat and the trust.
And oxytocin, I believe it's released when women are nursing, right? And the presumption is, and maybe this is well established, but certainly the presumption is that it facilitates bonding with the infant. So you're getting the flow of oxytocin, you're looking down at the kid, falling in love with it, as natural selection would like a mother to do.
Yes, absolutely. It's involved in the onset of labor. It's involved in milk letdown. I mean, the truth is there are receptors for oxytocin in about probably 60 different body tissues. So it's actually one of these things like acetylcholine, right? That it's just used over and over, and it's in bone. There are oxytocin receptors in bone, in gut, throughout the reproductive tract, in the heart, in the blood vessels. So it's everywhere. And so in some ways it might be one of those just very, very rough and ready systems for chemical communication within the within the body in general.
And it probably does a lot of different things, right?
Absolutely,
I mean, that's the way it is with these neurotransmitters.
Exactly.
But there was prior reason to think it's involved in feeling positively toward other members of your species. There's reason to believe that. Okay, so then what are your doubts about some of the work that's been done with trust and oxytocin, if doubts is the word?
Yeah, we just began to look at those studies, really just kind of taking the papers and spreading them out on our desks and looking at the statistical evidence that was being brought to bear. And at the time, and when I say we, I'm talking about myself and Colin Kammerer and Gideon Nave, who at the time was a graduate student with Colin, but is now, I guess, on the faculty at Wharton. We just were looking at these papers and thinking, to ourselves that this is such an important sort of this is such a foundational story in psychology right now. I mean, it helps people to set their priors for so many things. I wonder how strong this set of studies really is. I mean, if you look at sort of the statistical pattern, is this the kind of thing that should, be just sort of forming the kind of bedrock setting of people's prior beliefs about how the mind works? And so we just kind of laid them out on our desks and began to, sort of take notes. And it looked to us like this was one of those things where it actually was a little too good to be true.
What's a sign of that? What kind of thing do you see that makes you think that?
In the seminal paper, which was published in the journal called Nature, there were subjects run who half of whom had been given a jet of oxytocin up their noses and the other half had been given a placebo. And then they were asked to play a trust game with a stranger. And then the key dependent variable was, are you more trusting toward your partner in this game called the trust game? And the trust game, as I should probably explain, it's just this simple little game where there's two people involved. I've got some money, and I can choose to send some to you, Bob. And at that point, I've made my choice. I know in advance that you then will have the ability to send some of it back to me after it's been sort of multiplied by a market, if you like. So kind of the model you might use is sort of there's an investor and a trustee. So I'm going to invest some money with you. You're going to put it out on the market. Hopefully it will perform well. And then at the end, you will send some back to me. Maybe you won't, but I have to trust that you will because there's nothing sort of requiring you to send it back to me.
And who did?
An assay of trust.
Who did the original work on this? The paper you were looking at?
Oh gosh, this was a paper.
Yeah, I shouldn't have given you a pop quiz. I should have warned you if I was going to ask for.
It was a couple of neuroscientists and economists. One was named Mark. The first author was Marcus. No, sorry, it's not coming.
Don't
to
worry,
me.
it'll come to you probably in the conversation. I just wanted, in case people want to Google it, I wanted a name out there. And I asked because we had somebody on. I had somebody on several years ago who had done some of this work, and it may be one of the people you're talking about, but I can't remember his name either. This was years and years ago, and I believe he was an economist. He wrote a whole book.
Googling now.
Okay, I'll do, I'll entertain people while you're Googling. I'm going to juggle. Okay, this is scissors. This is eye drops. This is a ballpoint pen. Okay. Here we go. Okay, didn't work out as I'd hoped. How's the Googling going?
You distracted me with that amazing...
Let me try different objects. I think the objects were the problem. Scissors, you throw scissors up in the air and there's something in you that's saying, don't catch them.
I'm impressed. It's going to take me a minute to find this.
Okay, so we'll pause later for another entertainment break. So anyway, so what was the flashing red light, or at least yellow light?
Well, I mean, I don't want to get too wonky about it, but
yeah, if it's got some Greek letter, like if you're going to say it was the sigma function or something, we're going to just gloss over this.
So you know how sort of the idea behind p-values, right?
Oh, kind of. It's been a long time, but
I'm going to make it really simple. I mean, first of all, there's a sort of standard signal we use. It's kind of just a convention in the social scientists about whether we think something happened that was more extreme than you should be expecting by chance. Okay. Were the data so extreme that it'd be hard to expect them to be produced if there's no real process happening? And so we say if this p-value is smaller than 0.05, what it's saying is like these data are too poorly behaved to have come from a process that doesn't produce anything.
So wait, is this like statistical significance?
Exactly.
So it's also the same logic as like the confidence interval or so-called margin of error in a public opinion poll. The more data points you have, the more confident you are, the result, and so on.
That's exactly right. So what we're actually saying is 95% of the time, if we reran this study, would we expect the confidence interval to include 0?
Right.
Which would say there's no difference between the placebo group and this oxytocin group. All right, and what we want to be able to say is 95% of the time, if we reran this exact same study, that 95% confidence interval will not include the value of 0. So we say pretty sure it's not 0, right? Unfortunately, there's a thing you can do and again, I'm trying very carefully, trying to not get too wonky on this, but a lot of times when there's something interesting and important, you can relax the p-value. And you can say, I only want to look at one side of the kinds of things that could happen in the world. And because I really think oxytocin might be better than placebo at producing trust, then I'm going to move all of my uncertainty over to that part and really just look specifically at, is there evidence that it's too extremely, it's superiority to the placebo is too extreme to happen at a chance level. So you're sort of marginalizing the possibility that the placebo could be better than oxytocin at increasing trust. You're just going to like ignore that possibility and kind of like focus your microscope only on the possibility that it's got to be better or no different from.
I'm not sure I get intuitively how that would happen. I mean, at first I thought you were going to be talking about a case where you've got several variables. You've got oxytocin, they also drank lemonade, they did this, and you choose in retrospect which you want to emphasize, but that's not what you're talking about. And I suspect that we should let that go for now because it may be a little hard to grasp.
That's idea.
But this is something that it's not something the authors are concealing, right? It's in the published data that they made this decision.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question. This is all right in the papers. It's the sort of thing you would do if you very good-naturedly thought you'd found something important and you wanted to let people know about a phenomenon. You would just say, we're just focusing on the possibility that it's better than placebo, and sort of just not admitting, sort of not opening the statistical possibilities to the chance that it could be worse than the placebo at reducing trust. It's I don't want to say much more than that about it, but it's kind of one of those things you'll learn to be careful about. Okay. Because it's a way of capitalizing on chance. That's really what it's about. So it's a small study. You're only looking at this one possibility that it could be better. You end up sort of often over-interpreting. The risk here is that you over-interpret noise, because things are always going to vary a little bit, right? Two groups will always be slightly different.
Now, if you have enough data points, or if you do the experiment enough times, in theory, you should get more and more confident, right? I mean, that's Absolutely. The whole foundation of statistical significance, is having lots of data.
Yes, of course. And I want to say probably the most important thing is, like, this is the kind of thing. This was a small study. It's a few dozen people involved. It was an expensive study for them to running oxytocin and all this stuff, and getting blood and so forth. So very understandably, it's an exploratory experiment. It's the first thing of its kind. It's incredibly innovative, right? So you see something that looks like it's something you want the world to know about, and the world should want to know about, and you publish it. And it was really shocking and amazing. And
it got a lot of press, probably, in the popular media, right?
Yes, absolutely. And scholarly attention as well. So it became something that, other people went on to study.
Did they replicate the experiment and have positive findings?
Well, the next experiment that was done actually did not replicate that initial finding. But they had kind of an arm of the experiment that was, and they were very public about, no, this pattern that we found in this previous study didn't replicate.
Were these the same authors?
Some of the same authors. Okay. Right? But we found another phenomenon about how oxytocin might improve impaired trust once trust has been broken. And there were enough methodological differences between the two experiments that you can say, okay, I can see why you didn't exactly replicate your first one. And because it's different, you changed some of the details of the experiment. And it is really cool that you found that oxytocin appears to buffer people from violations of trust. So what a group of researchers with, terrific intentions can do is begin to build a case for the importance of oxytocin without ever having really gotten sort of established a bedrock finding.
So it's like every time you do the experiment, you find something about oxytocin, but it's not the same thing. That's kind of like what I was talking about when I said you decide in retrospect what you want to emphasize. I was imagining different variables that you want to emphasize, but in this case, it's different effects.
Yes, that's right. In the first one, oxytocin promotes trust. You're more willing to trust somebody, a stranger. And in the second experiment, you don't replicate that exactly, which is to be expected when you're doing experiments with small samples and so forth. But you do find this second, and the experiments differ in enough ways that it would make sense. But then you go on to find this second thing that's also cool and also suggests that oxytocin is important for trust. And so, a bunch of people with good intentions can look at this kind of record of established research findings and say, oxytocin promotes trust. And at that point, I think the horse is out of the barn, right? A couple of really high-profile papers in high-profile journals with a suggestion that, man, we've found the neurochemical basis for trust and trust formation. And I think, the field got very, justifiably very enthusiastic.
Well, were there many attempts to replicate by other authors? Because one of the problems, and we should say, there's been a whole, I don't want to call it a scandal in social psychology, but over the last few years, people have realized there's a lot of findings that have been widely reported that have not replicated. In a couple of kind of presumably aberrant cases, there was actual fraud. But the larger issue is just that well-meaning people do experiments, they find an effect, and then there's not that much of an incentive for other people to replicate them. Because if they replicate them, you don't get famous by saying something somebody's already said, right? So if you're thinking that the replication will be successful, why bother? It's not going to be good for your career, particularly. This is become a whole issue in psychology, and I know some measures have been taken to increase the frequency of attempted replications. But in this case, by the time you got to it, had entirely different research groups done replications?
Yes, they had, but it was similar. I mean, the pattern was kind of similar. They believing that the basic phenomenon had been established, people begin to cite, almost as a sort of folk way, well, we know oxytocin promotes trust in the trust game. Right. Through the kind of path of sort of findings that I was just sort of narrating for you. And then they do sort of a variation on the theme. And in doing that variation on the theme, they don't replicate that canonical finding, but they show something slightly different. So you get this weird sort of shaky chain of evidence. But all the while, with each new paper, like people's prior, belief, that oxytocin promotes trust is getting, gets stronger and stronger and stronger.
And at the risk of being too cynical, I mean, what you've just described, that does make sense as a career move. I mean, just trying to replicate something doesn't, but like fooling around with a thing until you found something that is trust related, but a little different from what's been found, that's the way you have a new finding, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And, and I want to,
I'm not saying these people are, I'm not saying anybody's consciously dishonest. It's just human nature to want to do, you see the same thing in punditry and argumentation generally. People want to say something new.
That's right.
And they want to convince themselves that they have the basis for saying it. And anyway.
Well, the reward structure of, people in the knowledge industry, it's not based on, being in the cheering section. Right. It's about, saying something novel or saying it in a different way. And certainly that's the name of the game in science and in, academia more generally. Give me something preferably true and novel, right? I mean, that's by, far and away, that's our preference. But it really does need to be novel in large measure.
So did you do, I mean, there's one way to test these kinds of things is to do a so-called meta-analysis, where you try to find all the comparable studies that have been done, and you in a certain sense, add up the data.
Yeah.
So you have a larger sample to work with in some sense, and you see if, on balance, there's really much going on. There's meta-analysis, and then there's straightforward replication. So which thing did you do?
We did a meta-analysis. The paper that, and I should say, this is a paper that Gideon was the first author on. Colin Kammerer was the second author, and I was the cleanup author. We did a meta-analysis of all the existing papers. I mean, and there really aren't many that are looking at if we give half of our group, oxytocin intranasally, sniffed right up and presumably up into their brains, although that's contentious too, and the other half a placebo, then they play this trust game. On average, can we find that the people in these studies have been more trusting if they got the oxytocin? So you can statistically aggregate the results of, what turned out to be, sort of 130 subjects who got oxytocin across all the experiments, and the 120 or 130 who got placebo. And then you can say, on average, across all 6 studies, what was the difference between these two groups of people? And there wasn't any, once you aggregate all of these data. So, we didn't set out to throw cold water on anything. We just wanted to know what was going on. We wanted to find out if this is a finding we could build on, as a field. So it's not like we were thrilled that to publish that it looks like there isn't much going on. We didn't jump up and down and, pat ourselves on the back. We're glad to know it, but we don't feel any tremendous satisfaction.
And then, so what's going on in the field now? Are people still, thinking maybe there's something here with oxytocin and doing experiments and maybe finding interesting things, or what? Well,
I hope they are, because we don't have, the brain isn't making oxytocin
for nothing,
for no reason, and it's not, laying down receptors in dozens of different, tissues for no reason. It's obviously doing a lot of things. So the work has to continue. And there's really interesting animal work that suggests, it may help to reduce reduce aging and wear and tear on heart and the inside linings of blood vessels and so forth. So there's lots of really promising things that may be doing in these animal models that we need to know about in human beings. But between this really bedrock finding looking kind of like a disappointment and the fact that we still don't know if any of that oxytocin is actually getting into the brain, where it can, in large enough quantities, to actually influence behavior, we're sitting here wondering, I truly don't know what the next step should be. I mean, I think the next step should be to determine whether it's safe and effective to give people oxytocin experimentally and get it into brain areas where it will affect behavior. we don't actually know that to be the case yet. There are lots of reasons, sort of basic physiological reasons, to be skeptical that any of that oxytocin can make it across the blood-brain barrier.
I mean, some things like, you know, people do cocaine through the... things can enter your nose and affect your brain. Right.
The problem with oxytocin is that it's a big molecule.
Yeah, okay.
It's a large molecule. So, you know, it's weird, right? I mean, I'm not a physiology guy by any means. I just have kind of a restless mind and sort of learn as I go. But I was astonished to discover that this is still an unknown. I mean, oxytocin as a therapeutic agent has been around for, my goodness, for decades and decades. And yet this basic question is still not answered.
Yeah.
And I think so, you know, social scientists have a tendency when it comes to, you know, we want to have that big picture is so compelling, right? That, you know, I want a consilient social science. You know, I read E.O. Wilson's book Consilience back in '98 or whenever it came out, and I was just enthralled with it. You mean, you know, he writes that it should be possible to have, you know, an integration of knowledge from, you know, from physics all the way down to the social sciences and humanities. And I read that and put it down and then read it again to make sure I knew what he was trying to say. And then I thought, this is what I want to do with my career. I want to figure out those links between biology and physiology and the brain and behavior and get down to societies and interactions between people. Like, that's an exciting kind of, you know, challenge. And I think lots of psychologists like me are really enthralled with that. So we can get ahead of the basic science, I think, sometimes. As a result.
The genius of that book was finding like this nice, beautiful word, consilience, to refer to a word that people didn't like, to refer to the same thing as a word that people didn't like, which is reductionism. Reductionism had become kind of a slur, but what he meant by consilience was the original kind of formal definition of reductionism. In other words, not that you're being simplistic in reducing phenomena up at this level of organization to phenomena at some lower level of organization, but just that you're doing it successfully. So that was smart. I mean, he resuscitated the idea maybe to some extent by finding a more user-friendly label for it. But he's a great writer. He's a great writer. So let's quickly allude to one other thing you sound skeptical of. That's now another thing that's become a very much cited finding. Now, this is so-called altruistic punishment. And it's done in, you know, laboratory settings. And the basic idea is somebody punishes someone for the good of the group, and they bear the cost and the sacrifice, and they do it for the good of the group. So, like in my neighborhood, like if there was one homeowner who their house was falling apart, they never mowed their lawn, and it was dragging everyone's property values down, but nobody wanted to say anything to the neighbor because they don't want to incur his wrath. That's a cost, right? And I went over and said something to the neighbor and incurred his enduring wrath, incurred his cost for the good of the neighborhood. That would be kind of altruistic punishment. Now, as it happens, I am the neighbor with the house that's falling apart in the yard that's going to the dogs. So I'm not going to be the one who delivers. And no one has approached me. And the fact that no one has approached me, I think, casts doubt on this idea. So I too have doubts about the idea. But there's also, I just want to say one more thing. There's a big kind of theoretical stake here in a certain sense, which is that in evolutionary biology, there's a long-standing tension between so-called group selectionists and so-called individual selectionists. To oversimplify, group selectionists think that things evolve readily for the good of the group. Not just like the family. Everybody thinks you sacrifice on behalf of your kin, but the larger group, like the tribe, the species, whatever. Group selectionists think that happens. And this would seem, if altruistic punishment is real, it would seem to be, not unequivocally or unambiguously, but it would seem to be the kind of thing that might be easily explained by a group selection dynamic. If I do go over to my neighbor's house and incur some costs on behalf of the whole neighborhood, you might think, well, okay, group selection may have played a role in human evolution. So anyway, you have this is a much publicized finding. that there is such a thing. And you're what? Are you starting to look at papers? Have you published on this, or you're just starting to look at papers in doubt?
We published one paper in 2013.
Oh, okay.
And we've got kind of this reservoir of about 5 other experiments that we've run since then to try to get to what's happening. But I mean, you characterized it perfectly. There's theoretical territory at stake, and it does come down to some extent. It can be, sort of roughly the territory can be sort of partitioned into the group selectionists versus sort of the Hamiltonian inclusive fitness people who'd rather parse up fitness using those tools. That I think I think less of that debate will get settled by proving or disproving the existence of altruistic punishment than many people think it would.
Yeah.
But as a pure matter of fact, I think it's really worthwhile for us to nail down whether, again, there's meat in the head that is going to motivate, Bob Wright's neighbors to incur a cost to with no benefit,
right.
benefit redounding to them, in order to impose some kind of cost on him that's going to make him a better neighbor.
Yeah, I mean, there's a small part of a diffuse benefit that redounds on them, but these are cases where that is outweighed by the cost they incur, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, another way to think about this that the kind of people I hang out with would think about it is, again, does human behavior look like it's being produced by an instinct that wants to reach out and punish people when there's no visible benefit for doing so? And if you ask people right on the street, look, imagine you see some injustice happen to some third party, would you get in the middle of that and intervene? Would you try to help the little old lady get her handbag back?
Right.
And people say, of course I would, or, if you saw I mean, most people do. I mean, we've done the survey work on this. Or would you, if you knew about somebody who was breaking some norm, would you stop them and correct them? And everybody says, yeah, of course I would. So we have this kind of lay belief, I think everyone does, that we would behave this way.
Mm-hmm.
So one way to think about this is, do people know their minds well? Do you know do we have enough familiarity with this weird situation to actually correctly predict how we would behave? And no one's actually bothered to kind of test that, because the way this altruistic punishment idea almost invariably gets tested is you say to people, hey, look, this person is going to make some choices about how stingy or how generous to be to this other guy or gal over there. If he's really stingy, would you be willing to punish him? And if so, how much? If he's really fair, would you be willing to punish? And if so, how much? So it's about getting commitments you're trying to get people to sort of forecast their behavior in the future,
mm-hmm.
and then make some commitments to behaving in that way without really having experienced the events firsthand. So I'm thinking, well, this is not how behavior happens. Usually a cause happens and then you see the effect. So it's the way these studies have been done are really appealing to economists, because you can it assumes that you can ask people what they do and they will reveal to you what they want to do. Pretty standard kind of economic conceits. But that's not the way I, as a psychologist, want to think about behavior. I want to make something weird happen in the laboratory and then see if people get angry about it. So we've done experiment after experiment where we've tried to get people to notice a third party being mistreated by somebody else, to see if this witness is going to step up and intervene and pay a cost to right the wrong. And what we found in a lot of studies is that yes, if you are mistreated yourself, you get angry at the bad guy and you're willing to impose some kind of retaliatory harm on the
Sure.
bad guy. But as often as not, people, when they see a stranger mistreat another stranger, either they don't notice that it's happened. It's just it doesn't cross Their radar, it doesn't even show up as a blip on their sort of attentional radar screen. Or if they do see it, they're not particularly angered by it. And even when they're angered by it, they seem kind of reluctant to engage in any costly action that would, sort of allow them to retaliate against.
So are you setting up situations where there are like Confederates actually acting out roles, and the person, the actual subject of the experiment doesn't realize that they're not real people doing real things?
Exactly.
I see. So you're saying, so you're asking, well, you're not questioning the robustness of the finding in the original behavioral economics finding in these highly artificial settings of game theory.
Right.
You're wondering whether that translates into more real world situations.
Precisely. So, if you're in my lab, you come in and you write an essay on a topic that's important to Bob, and a few other people that you're interacting with write essays that are important to them. Then you take turns kind of giving each other feedback, and some jerk in your little group of 4 is going to give somebody some feedback that's really unpleasant. Like, this is one of the dumbest things I've ever read. I hope this person learns something here in college. And it's, not pleasant feedback to receive. It's insulting. It seems out of proportion. It seems rude. And
what might they do? Okay, go ahead. So either they do what or they do what?
So we then turn over to them a technology that they believe is a tool that they can use to give a sound blast to somebody in their ears. We tell them that we're testing some sound equipment, and we'd like to know a person's reaction to these sounds. You, as the sound administrator, choose how much sound, how much volume to give, and how long to give it. So it's kind of you can discover that you're holding a weapon in your hand that gives unpleasant sound blasts to another person. So if you're angry at somebody and motivated to harm them, you should discover that this is a weapon. I've got a weapon I can use to hurt somebody. If you're not angry and not motivated to harm somebody, you just think you're in a sound experiment. We find that people who have been directly harmed do seem to discover that this is a weapon, and they turn the sound volume up and they administer it longer. But if they're just they've witnessed somebody mistreating a third party, they don't blast them particularly hard at all with sound. And they're not angry either.
Okay. Now, this is not a case where they have the option of delivering a punishment that will be seen to be in retaliation for the wrong. In other words, the people who are who they think are getting like deafening noise don't know that that's for punishment.
They don't know. They don't know. All they know is somebody's giving them That's all the subject knows is, here's an opportunity to deliver some sound to this person who was rude, either to me or to this third party.
There's a really famous experiment that this reminds me of that was done a couple of miles from where I am now, decades ago. Are you familiar with the Princeton Theological Seminary experiments?
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely.
It was testing something else, but they set up a supposedly needy person lying in the sidewalk moaning, and they wanted to see who would stop and help. And that's not punishment, but it is a costly form of altruism.
That's right. Yeah. And
actually, what they found was, the people who walked by, they had prepped in 2 different ways. I mean, these people didn't know that the suffering stranger was a Confederate, but they had been told, they had all been told, you have to go over and give a talk now, across campus on the other side of the theological seminary, and some had been told you're late, and some had been told you're not late. And it turned out, I mean, it doesn't sound shocking, but the people who were in a hurry were not inclined to stop. But the other thing was, I mean, they tested various, I think personality factors and so on, and like nothing was predictive except whether you were in a hurry.
That's it. That was the only one. And I think people ignore the power. I'm really glad you brought that up. One of the things we always talk about, I guess one of the worlds I traffic in is the world of social psychology. And one of the things we always talk about is situations have forces in them that we really can't anticipate the power of unless we're in them. And that would be an example of that. We all think, oh man, some person in need looks non-responsive, sitting in the alley, looks like they're in bad shape. I would absolutely stop and see if they're okay, right? We want to hold that belief about ourselves. But in fact, the only predictor of whether you're going to stop or not is if you're in a hurry. Being in a hurry really causes people to change their behavior away from what they, their best selves would do.
And if you observed them walking by, you would make a judgment about the person.
That's exactly right.
You'd say, well, that's a good person, and I bet they do that every time. But no, it's just a person in a hurry. It's just a person who is either in a hurry or not in a hurry.
Yeah.
So, okay. So why don't we talk a little about your forgiveness book? So we've talked about a couple of kinds of what you could call social instincts or social sentiments. Altruist, self-sacrifice in some sense, and trust. Forgiveness is a big one. It again, I'm sure you think it's kind of part of human nature, not just a cultural construct.
Yep.
What are the big? What are your big findings about what things are conducive to forgiveness, like in terms of when people do and don't forgive?
Well, the model we've been operating under is that relationships are clearly important. I mean, humans are so dependent on other people, through the entire life course. As a result, you can't deliver a big sound blast to everybody who insults you and walk away. Just relationships are too important. Not every relationship is going to be important long term or valuable, but you have to have some people around you. And in this mobile world we're in, we feel, we have this sense that, well, we can just start over all the time. But that's probably not the way the world looked, while our ancestors were evolving. So if somebody harmed you, it was important to weigh two things. One is, how likely is this person to harm me again in the same way? I mean, is this person going to continue to be a risk to me? And then secondly, does this despite the fact that this person humiliated me or took advantage of me or damaged another friendship of mine or hurt one of my kids or insulted one of my parents, despite the fact that they did that, does my relationship with this bad person have enough long-term value to me going forward that I really need to think about patching things up? Mm-hmm. And so what we think probably the mind is structured to do with regard to forgiving harms is weigh two kinds of quantities, if you like. One is, how likely is this person to harm me again in the same way? And the second is, how much value does this relationship hold in store for me long term going forward? Can we put this thing back on a positive track to my benefit? Mm-hmm. Either because they are my old friend or because it's a loved one of mine or for some other reason. So ultimately, you can think of those as sort of tubes, informational tubes that the little forgiveness bit of meat in the head has access to and wants to process. Mm-hmm. Likelihood of future exploitation, relationship value going forward. And so you just back that out and say, well, and gosh, in my own life, what do I look to for evidence about those two what real world events would give me evidence about somebody's value to me going forward or their likelihood of harming me again? And so those are the kinds of things we're trying to do, is make a link between real events happening after a damaged relationship, the kind of information it might convey, and then whether that information does seem like it's getting processed in order to produce good forgiveness decisions down the road. Okay, so it's a very pragmatic calculation. It isn't necessarily conscious. I mean, there may be varying degrees, I guess, of conscious consideration, but the very feeling of the feelings that give rise to forgiveness, to expressions of forgiveness, are themselves just kind of designed to wax and wane in accordance with an underlying calculation. That's what we think. I mean, in general, we don't think people are doing sort of following Benjamin Franklin's rule of, putting all the costs of a course of action on a piece of paper and the benefits of a course of action, and then, action number 2, and then sort of crossing out, equals until you come to, a decision about what the right course of action is. I mean, you could do that, but this is probably more intuitive stuff. And when it is converted from the sort of language of the mind into language we can speak, we end up saying things like, I don't know, we like to go to the same basketball game. He's got, we both have season tickets together, and we still like, despite what he did, we still like to hang out on weeknights and go to basketball games. Or we have these 2 kids to take care of together. Or she apologized. She undid the damage. The person made me whole, paid back the debt. Those would be the sort of things we'd end up saying to justify why we might forgive. And we can't really see the information traveling through the tubes, if you like, and the meat and the head grinding on it. All we know is we feel like forgiving, and we think these are the reasons why. And
it seems to be the case that someone apologizing makes it a lot easier, but presumably that is being taken, perhaps unconsciously, as a signal, as a cue to these kinds of considerations. Like if they apologize with enough earnestness, maybe that is a signal that they won't exploit me again. And maybe that's a signal that we can do business together in the future successfully, and so on. So one thing that goes on is, something we already mentioned, trust factors into this, right? I mean, a sense of trust is conducive to forgiveness. So does this help us at all with the most intractable, you think about something like Israel-Palestine, where on both sides there's a sense of grievance directed at least toward some people. Now, there may be an asymmetry in the sense that probably Palestinians have more of a sense of grievance toward, kind of the state of Israel, because they feel displaced by it, whereas Israelis may have grievances toward individual Palestinians who have done things they may or may not generalize. But anyway, so it's complicated for all those reasons. But have you given any thought in general to, bringing peace and love to the world, or even cooperation?
Yeah, I mean, a little closer to home for me anyway is, the attempt to end the war with FARC in Colombia. I think a lot of observers of the past couple of years were astonished to watch the Colombian people. It was a small margin, but it was a clear margin nevertheless. Watch the people reject a peace deal with the FARC, right? To elites, they were astonished. How, why wouldn't you want to end the last war in the Western Hemisphere? And so, you've been in a civil war for 5 decades. Why wouldn't you want to end it? But, if you hear the rank and file talk about this, they're really talking about issues of assurance. They're talking about issues of assurance, and they're talking about issues of exploitation risk going forward. What's going to happen to the leaders? They are going, one of the things that, is kind of in the DNA of this deal is they have immediate access to political power. That's a very worrying condition for law-abiding Colombians who've been, watching this civil war take place for, half their lives. What do you mean we're going to give them access to political power effective immediately? There are concerns about whether rebels of, whether FARC soldiers are going, particularly commanders, are just going to kind of rehabilitate their networks into crime networks. I mean, that's a really, that's no trivial matter. I mean, if this is just going to become a war against organized crime, then sort of what have we gained through trying to patch up this civil war, through this agreement? So I think if you don't metabolize these concerns to everybody's satisfaction, you don't end up with a satisfied populace. So for better or for worse, right, the government has decided to avoid a second referendum and just simply ratify this thing legislatively. And that might turn out to be a wise choice. I actually don't I know I don't have any judgment about whether that was a good idea or not. It was different, you know, and it's going to rankle a lot of people. But I guess, you know, they're in for a penny, in for a pound now. We're going to see if people's concerns about exploitation risk and relationship value and their misgivings about those will end up being well-founded.
Yeah, and in retrospect, it may be seen as a kind of collective and essentially unconscious, probably bargaining ploy, right? I mean, if they go back to the table and they get a little more, you know, and as I said, unconscious for sure. There wasn't some kind of mass collective explicit calculation. At the same time, when people do resist reconciliation, especially at an individual level, that's kind of what, in some sense, may be going on there. You know, unconsciously, adaptively. You know what, I think, I like you, I don't profess to know about this particular situation to know what would constitute wisdom, but I do think sometimes in situations like this, the problem is an insufficiently cynical view of human nature, and by that I mean that, you know, these guys look at their long-term enemies, these guys who are running FARC, and first of all, you know, we've already talked about how readily people label someone good or bad based, you know, on behavior they've only observed under certain situations, right?
Right.
It's like, yeah, they've been vicious rebel leaders. That's because being a rebel leader was their job, right? I mean, it's like people are actually sufficiently malleable that if you put them in a new situation where the attainment of social status entails behaving more nicely, it's the cynical view of human nature that predicts that they will behave nicely. Right, because you have rearranged their incentive structure, and I think often people hang onto this kind of essentialist view of political actors. They're either good or they're bad, and they're going to be, if they've been bad, they're going to be bad forever. But actually, what they were was very good rebel leaders, and maybe you can turn them into good something else. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great example, and another way in which that ends up being important is that, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, if you were to bring this back to Israel and Palestine, you can have good elites with peace-loving and conciliatory intentions privately who still have a country to run.
Right.
And if they have, you know, and to run a country, you have to look like you're putting national interests above other kinds of interests. And, you know, because of all kinds of things about discounting the future and, you know, the sort of discounting of the welfare of others that you have to do if you're going, you know, countries have to have, like creatures have to have skins with beginnings and ends. Right. And, you know, our interests have to end. Our interests about people have to drop once there are people on the other side of our borders. If you can't acknowledge those, you know, sort of tragic truths about statecraft, then you can't. You won't lead very long.
Yeah.
So, you know, there has to also be kind of a sort of. It's hard to get over it's hard to get out of the attractor that being a hardliner in these kind of negotiations pulls for.
Sure. If
you want to continue to run the country.
And when you try to do a deal, you're probably going to have a domestic political rival who's going to say, you're selling us out. I mean, you know, the lines are very predictable. Like one of these lines is like, Vladimir Putin or whoever is thumbing his nose at us, right? I mean, that's like a classic, like, he's disrespecting us and trying to humiliate us, and he holds us in contempt. I mean, that's just like pushing a little button on human nature. And whenever anyone says that some foreign leader is thumbing their nose on us, I totally shut out whatever argument they're making because I'm so disgusted by their rhetorical technique. But, you know, this is also the reason. I mean, this is not the place to deliver a political editorial, so I won't mention any particular countries. But if you say we're in a country that had just elected a president whose political instinct was actually to cultivate fear and hatred in people, you would be making it hard for yourself in the future to do certain kinds of deals that you might actually believe are in the national interest. I mean, unless, I mean, who knows? Who knows who's going to, you know? I guess if you sufficiently command the respect and obedience of enough people, you can convince them that any deal is good. But even in the best of cases, I would say a certain irrational, sometimes irrational fear is something leaders have to contend with, and sometimes there's more of that floating around than others.
That's right. That's right. Well, you fight the battle that's in front of you today, but it does sometimes restrict your options for what's coming forward in the future, and that may be the dilemma we're going to face.
Yeah. Okay, we're just about out of time. There's one other thing you mentioned that you're working on, and if you have like just a couple of sentences you want to say about it, I want to at least give you the chance. And it's about, over the long haul of history, changes in the way people think about the welfare of strangers, maybe even strangers halfway around the world, about altruism in that context, not of like being nice to somebody that you know and can see necessarily, but somebody who's almost like a hypothetical construct in a certain sense. I call them sort of notional strangers. I mean, we know there are these people around the world right now that are, some of them are just living grindingly miserable lives, and I mean, it's just it's empirically verifiable. You could fly over there and watch them be miserable, but we don't have any direct contact with them, and that's really weird, historically weird and sort of evolutionarily novel. That you could know these people are out there and know that you could do something to assist them, right? I mean, marginal utility. I have money I make today that there's no way I'm going to enjoy in the same way someone could enjoy it if I sent it to them to buy food for their families, or to buy, a gas generator so they could start a small business, and so forth. Right. So there's probably no motivational system in me that's designed for helping them out. So to me, the really interesting thing is, I've got, I think about psychology like an I try to think about it like an evolutionary biologist would. There's probably adaptations in them. I read a really influential book called The Moral Animal. You might perhaps sounds great.
Yeah, it's provocative.
I'll have to put it on my shelf.
That's right. But we probably have cognitive systems in the head to help us care about our friends and friends and loved ones and business partners and so forth, if you like. But there's no meat in the head for the caring about that notional stranger, and yet we're doing it now. We're doing it a lot, and and if you sort of look at the long arc of history over the past couple of thousands of years, we're getting better at it, and larger and larger proportions of our wealth is going to trying to improve other people's lives. So I've just gotten really interested in sort of the key ideas and the key institutions that have developed through history to kind of get us to where we are now, where on one hand, even like domestically, we sort of expect our governments to appropriate individual wealth and then redistribute it to the tune of sort of 40% of GDP each year. Some of us don't like that percentage, but it's not going to go much lower than that. It's not going to go much higher than that anytime soon. We're doing that for each other now within countries, but also, there are a lot of philanthropies, a lot of model philanthropists who are really appealing to a lot of people with a message that simply says, let's find out where we can put a dollar to its most effective use anywhere in the world, and let's get it there. So I'm really interested in what sort of happened in the past 3,000 years to get us from sort of here to there to here, I suppose.
So you're working on a book on this?
It's a book, yeah, and I, hopefully it'll come out sometime before I retire.
Yeah, well, that is the hope with books.
Yeah, that's
sometimes
right.
It happens, sometimes it doesn't. But I'm optimistic in your case because you have a track record. You're the author of Beyond Revenge, The Evolution of the Forgiveness Instinct. And people should also check out the edited volume, The Psychology of Gratitude, that you did. And, I hope you'll have time to come back and chat again, because you've done a lot of stuff, published a lot of papers, and there are whole subjects that we have not touched on that I think would be interesting.
I'd love that. Yeah, anytime.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Mike.
Thanks, man.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.